Daniel Martinez stood alone in his sun-weathered cornfields when 3 black SUVs crawled down the dusty road toward his family's farm. The Sinaloa cartel's enforcers had been terrorizing local farmers across the border region for months, but they had no idea the quiet man in mud-stained boots was a former Navy SEAL who'd led some of the deadliest missions in Ramadi. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow we've saved something extra special for you. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the fertile valleys of Santa Rosa, a small farming community nestled in the foothills of southern Texas. Just 15 miles from the Mexican border, the town had always maintained a delicate balance between two worlds. The sweet scent of ripening corn mingled with the earthy aroma of freshly irrigated soil, creating the distinct perfume of harvest season that Daniel had known since childhood. At 42, Daniel's weathered face and calloused hands told the story of a man who'd spent his life working the land, but they revealed nothing of the 16 years he'd served in the Navy's most elite Special Operations Unit. His father's 300 acres had been calling him home for years, and after his final deployment 2 months ago, he'd finally answered. The transition from combat operations to farming had been easier than expected. Both required patience, discipline, and the ability to read the smallest changes in your environment. The Martinez farm stood as a testament to 3 generations of careful stewardship. The original farmhouse, built by Daniel's grandfather after he immigrated from Mexico in 1952, sat nestled between 2 gentle hills, its whitewashed walls glowing orange in the dying light. The newer barn, constructed just last spring, housed the modern equipment that had helped the farm survive while others in the region struggled. The property represented everything his family had achieved through decades of hard work and determination. Maria Suarez, who ran the local grocery store, had been the first to warn him about the cartel's expanding influence. They'd started small, demanding protection money from businesses in border towns, then gradually moving north, targeting farms and ranches across the region. Their method was always the same: arrive with a show of force, make threats wrapped in polite suggestions, then escalate until they got what they wanted. 3 families had already sold their land for a fraction of its worth, unable to handle the pressure and intimidation. Daniel watched the dust clouds rising behind the SUVs as they approached, his mind automatically calculating distances and angles, identifying potential cover, and noting the advantage his elevated position provided. Old habits that had kept him alive through 4 combat deployments. His right hand, resting casually on the worn wood of his grandfather's fence post, showed no sign of tension, though his combat-honed senses had shifted into a higher state of awareness. The evening birds continued their chorus in the surrounding mesquite trees, their songs carrying across fields that had sustained his family for generations. A gentle breeze rustled through the corn stalks, creating a peaceful counterpoint to the growing rumble of approaching engines. The contrast reminded him of countless missions, how the quietest moments often preceded the most intense action. Last harvest had been good, providing enough profit to upgrade their irrigation system and repair the old tractor his father had stubbornly refused to replace. Daniel had spent the morning reviewing plans to expand their organic certification to the western fields, a move that could significantly increase their profit margins. Now, as he watched the SUVs growing larger in the distance, he wondered if the cartel's arrival would force him to put those plans on hold. Local law enforcement had proven ineffective against the cartel's expansion. Sheriff Roberts, a good man who'd served with Daniel's father on the town council, had admitted as much during their conversation at last week's farmers' market. The cartels operated in the shadows, using fear and intimidation rather than outright violence, making it difficult for authorities to build cases against them. They were careful to maintain a veneer of legitimacy, presenting themselves as businessmen offering investment opportunities to struggling farmers. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, the kind of Texas sunset that usually brought Daniel a sense of peace. He'd seen similar skies in Iraq and Afghanistan, but they'd been tainted by the sounds of combat and the weight of constant vigilance. Here, working his family's land, he'd finally found the peace that had eluded him since his first deployment. The approaching SUVs threatened to shatter that hard-won tranquility. Sarah Chen, the new agricultural extension agent who'd been helping local farmers modernize their operations, had stopped by yesterday with satellite maps showing optimal irrigation patterns. Her eyes had lingered on the scars visible beneath his rolled-up sleeves, but she hadn't asked about his service. Instead, they'd discussed soil composition and crop rotation, the normal concerns of a peaceful farming community. She'd mentioned hearing rumors about cartel activities in the region, her voice carrying a note of worry that spoke to the growing tension in the area. The lead SUV slowed as it approached the farm's main gate, its tinted windows reflecting the dying sunlight like dark mirrors. Daniel remained motionless, his posture relaxed but prepared, much like the stance he'd maintained during countless operations in urban combat zones. The peaceful evening air carried the sound of car doors opening, then closing with deliberate force. The cartel members were announcing their presence, making sure their arrival commanded attention. Behind him, the farmhouse stood silent, its windows reflecting the sunset's golden light. His mother had passed away 3 years ago while he was deployed, and his father now lived in town, leaving Daniel alone on the property he'd sworn to protect. The solitude suited him, providing space to process the memories of combat that sometimes surfaced in quiet moments. But now, as he watched 4 men emerge from the vehicles, he felt grateful for the isolation. Whatever happened next, there would be no civilians in the crossfire. The evening wind carried the sweet scent of blooming wildflowers from the untilled field where his mother had always planted them. She'd believed in maintaining wild spaces alongside the cultivated ones, saying it kept the land honest. The memory of her wisdom brought a slight smile to Daniel's face, even as his trained eye noted the bulges beneath the cartel members' expensive jackets that suggested concealed weapons. Some battles were fought with guns, others with patience and an unshakable stance. The next few minutes would determine which kind of confrontation this would become. The gravel crunched beneath expensive leather shoes as the men approached, their casual stride masking practiced coordination that Daniel recognized from years of combat experience. The lead figure, tall and well-dressed in a tailored gray suit, moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding respect through fear. Behind him, 3 men spread out in a loose formation that spoke of military training, likely former Mexican special forces who'd been bought by cartel money. The late afternoon light caught the gold rings adorning the leader's fingers, sending brief flashes across the dusty farmyard. A heavy gold chain peeked from beneath his crisp collar, its gleam a stark contrast to Daniel's worn work clothes and mud-stained boots. The man's manicured appearance seemed out of place against the backdrop of agricultural equipment and weathered farm buildings, like a shark swimming through peaceful waters. In town that morning, Daniel had overheard whispers about similar visits to other farms in the region. The Rodriguez family, 3 properties over, had suddenly decided to sell their century-old ranch last week. Their daughter Angela, who worked at the local diner, had been unusually quiet when serving breakfast, her eyes showing the strain of sleepless nights. The pattern was becoming clear. The cartel was methodically working its way through the area, acquiring property through a combination of threats and lowball offers. The evening wind carried the sound of distant tractors from neighboring farms. a reminder of the community's rhythms continuing despite the growing shadow of cartel influence. A hawk circled lazily overhead, its cry piercing the tension-filled air as it searched for prey in the freshly plowed fields. The natural world seemed oblivious to the human drama unfolding below, continuing its eternal cycles regardless of man's conflicts. Daniel's military training had taught him to read subtle signs of impending confrontation. He noticed how the man on the left kept his right hand loose, ready to reach beneath his designer jacket. The one on the right scanned the surroundings with too much intensity for a casual visitor, his eyes moving in the practiced pattern of someone assessing potential threats. The third man positioned himself to maintain clear lines of sight to both the road and the farmhouse, his stance betraying professional training. The setting sun cast long shadows across the yard, turning the approaching men into elongated silhouettes that stretched across the packed earth. Daniel remained by his fence post, his posture relaxed, but his mind racing through scenarios and contingencies, just as he had done countless times in combat zones. The weight of his phone in his pocket offered quiet reassurance. Sheriff Roberts' number was just a button press away, though Daniel doubted local law enforcement could arrive in time to make any difference. The sweet scent of hay from the nearby barn mingled with the metallic smell of gun oil that the wind carried from the approaching group. It was a scent Daniel knew well from his years of service, one that triggered combat-honed instincts he'd been trying to leave behind. His father's words from that morning echoed in his mind. "The land is worth fighting for, son, but make sure the price isn't too high." The old man had seen enough violence during his own military service to know its true cost. Sarah Chen's warning from yesterday took on new significance as the men drew closer. She'd mentioned other farms in the region receiving similar visits, followed by mysterious accidents. Irrigation systems failing, equipment breaking down, crops being damaged by unknown causes. The cartel's methods were subtle at first, building pressure gradually until resistance became too costly to maintain. The lead figure paused several paces away, maintaining what he likely thought was a safe distance. Daniel noted the expensive watch on his wrist, its face catching the dying sunlight. The man's smile appeared practiced, diplomatic, but his eyes remained cold and calculating, assessing Daniel with the predatory gaze of someone used to identifying weaknesses in others. Birds that had been singing in the nearby mesquite trees fell silent, as if sensing the growing tension in the air. The only sounds were the gentle rustle of corn stalks in the evening breeze and the distant drone of a crop duster working the fields to the north. Time seemed to slow, each moment stretching out like the lengthening shadows across the farmyard. The quiet was reminiscent of moments before operations in Ramadi, the artificial calm that preceded violence. Daniel had learned to exist comfortably in such moments, maintaining his composure while others grew anxious and made mistakes. His breathing remained steady, his heart rate controlled, as years of SEAL training kept his body and mind prepared without betraying any sign of readiness. Dust devils swirled across the yard, picking up loose straw and creating a momentary barrier between Daniel and his visitors. Through the swirling debris, he caught glimpses of the men adjusting their positions slightly, unconsciously responding to his stillness with growing unease. They were used to intimidating farmers and ranchers, not confronting someone who stood their ground with such absolute calm. The last rays of sunlight glinted off the chrome grille of the lead SUV, its polished surface reflecting the darkening sky. The vehicle's engine ticked as it cooled, the sound marking the passing seconds like a countdown timer. Behind it, the other two SUVs remained idling, their drivers invisible behind tinted windows, but undoubtedly ready to respond to any signal. From their leaders, the evening's peaceful transition had been irreversibly disrupted, the normal sounds of the farm replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to press down on the scene like a physical weight. Even the wind appeared to hold its breath, the corn stalks standing unnaturally still as nature itself waited to see how this confrontation would unfold. "Senor Martinez," the leader spoke, his accent carefully cultivated to sound educated, international. "I am Miguel Ramirez. I represent certain business interests seeking investment opportunities in this region." His smile remained fixed, professional, but his dark eyes swept the property with the calculating gaze of someone already claiming ownership. The gold rings on his fingers caught the fading light as he gestured expansively at the surrounding fields. The man to his right, whose military bearing was obvious to Daniel's trained eye, shifted his weight slightly, adjusting his position to maintain a tactical advantage. A scar ran along his jaw, disappearing beneath his collar, the kind of mark left by combat rather than accident. His eyes never stopped moving, scanning the farm buildings, the distant tree line, the upstairs windows of the house, following the practiced pattern of someone assessing potential threats. Behind them, the third man had positioned himself near the SUVs, his broad shoulders straining against his expensive suit. A tattoo peeked from beneath his collar, the distinctive pattern marking him as former Mexican Special Forces, likely GAFE. His stance was too rigid, too alert for a simple business meeting. The fourth man, leaner and more wiry, maintained his position on the left, his right hand never straying far from his concealed weapon. "We've heard good things about your operation, Senor Martinez," Ramirez continued, his voice carrying across the evening air with practiced smoothness. "Your family has built something impressive here. 3 generations, I believe." The question carried an undercurrent of threat, a reminder that he knew details about the Martinez family history. His snakeskin boots left precise impressions in the dusty soil as he took another step forward, testing boundaries. The cooling engines of the SUVs ticked in the background, punctuating the tension-filled silence. Through the vehicle's tinted windows, Daniel could make out the silhouettes of at least 3 more men, their shadowy forms barely visible in the gathering dusk. The cartel never traveled light, always ensuring they had overwhelming numbers to support their negotiations. A distant coyote's call echoed across the fields, its mournful cry seeming to underscore the gravity of the moment. The sun had dipped lower, casting deep shadows that transformed the familiar landscape into something more ominous. The worn wooden fence posts cast bars of darkness across the ground, like the shadows of prison cells stretching toward the gathered men. "Your neighbors, the Rodriguez family, they recently came to understand the benefits of partnership with our organization," Ramirez said, brushing an invisible speck of dust from his sleeve. "Very profitable arrangement for everyone involved. Their daughter Angela, such a lovely girl. She must be relieved to see her family free from the burdens of managing such a large property." The threat in his words was clear, wrapped in a veneer of polite business talk. Daniel had heard similar speeches in combat zones, delivered by warlords and insurgent leaders who clothed their violence in the language of cooperation and mutual benefit. His time in special operations had taught him to recognize the patterns, to see through the facade to the underlying menace. The man with the scar shifted again, his hand brushing back his jacket to reveal the holstered weapon beneath. It wasn't an accident. The movement was calculated, meant to remind Daniel of the implied threat behind Ramirez's diplomatic words. The evening breeze carried the familiar scent of gun oil mixed with expensive cologne, an incongruous combination that seemed to epitomize the cartel's attempt to mask violence with sophistication. "Times are changing, Senor Martinez," Ramirez continued, gesturing at the surrounding fields. "Small independent farms like yours, they face so many challenges. Weather, market prices, equipment failures." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "Accidents can happen so easily in this line of work. It would be unfortunate if your irrigation system were to malfunction during the dry season. The former gaffe operator by the SUVs had begun a slow, casual circuit of the vehicles. His movement, designed to look natural while gradually expanding the cartel's control of the space. Daniel recognized the tactic. He'd used similar maneuvers during operations in urban environments. The man's eyes never left Daniel, watching for any reaction to this subtle display of tactical superiority. From somewhere in the distance came the sound of farm machinery shutting down for the day, a reminder of the normal rhythms of life continuing beyond this confrontation. The contrast between the peaceful agricultural setting and the lethal potential contained within these visitors created an almost surreal atmosphere, like two different worlds colliding in the fading Texas daylight. Our organization has resources, connections that could benefit you greatly, Ramirez said, his tone reasonable, almost paternal. We can guarantee fair prices for your crops, ensure your equipment stays in good working order. His smile widened, slightly, showing perfect white teeth. Protection, Senor Martinez. In these uncertain times, everyone needs protection. The wiry man on the left had completed his own subtle repositioning, establishing clear fields of fire while maintaining the appearance of casual disinterest. His movements betrayed professional training, not military, but someone well-versed in cartel enforcement tactics. The gold chain around his neck caught the light as he turned, momentarily flashing like a signal mirror. Overhead, the hawk that had been circling earlier made one final pass, its shadow sliding across the gathering. Like a dark omen, the evening wind had picked up, sending whispers through the cornstalks and carrying with it the first hints of nighttime coolness. Soon, the automatic security lights would activate, transforming the familiar farmyard into a stage lit for confrontation. Daniel's silence in response to Ramirez's offer stretched the moment like a wire pulled taut. His green eyes, which had seen through night vision scopes in the darkest corners of Ramadi, studied each man with the calm assessment of a predator rather than the fear of prey. The evening shadows played across the scars on his forearms, testament to battles fought in places these men couldn't imagine. A memory flashed through his mind. Baghdad 2019, his team surrounded in an abandoned marketplace, the air thick with tension before all hell broke loose. He'd worn the same expression then, a mask of calm that concealed lethal capability. The weight of his phone in his pocket reminded him of the satellite phone from that operation, when they'd maintained radio silence for 6 hours while maneuvering through enemy territory. The former gaffe operator had completed his circuit of the vehicles, his movement bringing him closer to Daniel's position. To untrained eyes, it might have appeared casual, but Daniel recognized the coordinated effort to establish tactical superiority. His mind automatically calculated angles, distances, and potential cover. The barn to his left, the tractor to his right, the drainage ditch behind him. Old habits that had kept him and his team alive through countless operations. Your offer is generous. Daniel finally spoke, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded SEAL teams through the most dangerous missions imaginable. But the Martinez family has always managed our own affairs. Each word was measured, precise, like the controlled breathing he'd used during long-range target acquisition. The slight shift in Ramirez's expression suggested he'd caught something unexpected in Daniel's tone. The scar-faced man's hand twitched almost imperceptibly toward his concealed weapon, a movement that might have gone unnoticed by most, but to Daniel's combat-honed senses, it broadcast violent intent as clearly as a shout. The former SEAL's muscles coiled with practiced readiness, though his outward appearance remained unchanged. Years of close-quarters combat had taught him that the deadliest predators rarely advertise their capabilities. Wind rustled through the nearby cornstalks, creating shadows that danced across the hardened faces of the cartel members. The automated security lights flickered to life, casting harsh illumination across the scene. In the new lighting, Daniel could better see the tension in their poses, the way their confidence had begun to waver in the face of his unnatural calm. Their experience had taught them to expect either immediate compliance or nervous resistance. This composed evaluation was outside their usual playbook. Ramirez adjusted his gold watch, a tell that spoke of growing uncertainty. "Perhaps you don't fully understand the situation, Senor Martinez," he said, his diplomatic tone taking on a harder edge. "The business environment in this region is becoming complicated. Small operations like yours need strong partners to survive." The implied threat hung in the air, like the scent of approaching rain. Images from Daniel's last deployment flashed. Through his mind, a village in northern Afghanistan. Local farmers facing similar threats from warlords who wrapped their extortion in the language of protection. He'd seen this pattern before, recognized the escalating pressure that preceded violence. His time with naval special warfare had taught him to read these situations like others read weather patterns. The wiry enforcer had shifted his position again, trying to move into Daniel's blind spot. It was a trained movement, professional, but to someone who had conducted night operations in urban combat zones, it might as well have been telegraphed with flashing lights. Daniel adjusted his stance minutely, maintaining awareness of all four men while appearing to focus solely on Ramirez. A distant train whistle echoed across the fields, its mournful sound carrying memories of countless nights spent watching similar scenes unfold in distant lands. The familiar weight of his dog tags beneath his work shirt pressed against his chest, a reminder of the warrior that lay beneath the farmer's exterior. Those small pieces of metal had witnessed more violence than these cartel enforcers could. "Imagine, your father served in the military, didn't he?" Ramirez asked, his tone suggesting the information had been carefully gathered. "A Marine, if I'm not mistaken. Then he came home to work this land." The cartel leader's eyes narrowed slightly. "You followed his example, joined the Navy, I believe, though our information about your service record is incomplete." The admission of surveillance didn't surprise Daniel. The cartel's intelligence network was thorough, but his SEAL operations had been carefully scrubbed from public records. The missions he'd led, the operations he'd completed, they existed only in classified files and in the nightmares of those who had witnessed his team's efficiency firsthand. The automatic sprinkler system engaged in a distant field, its rhythmic clicking providing a steady counterpoint to the tension. Water droplets caught the security lighting, creating brief rainbows that seemed incongruously beautiful against the gathering darkness. Nature itself seemed determined to remind Daniel of the peace he'd found here, the tranquility that these men threatened to shatter. The scar-faced man's eyes had locked onto the visible scars on Daniel's forearms, his expression showing the first signs of professional recognition. Special operators could often recognize their own kind, and something about Daniel's bearing had triggered warning signals in the former soldier's combat-trained instincts. The evening breeze carried the smell of gun oil and tension, familiar, scents that had accompanied every high-stakes operation in Daniel's military career. Ramirez took a calculated step forward, his snakeskin boots leaving precise impressions in the dusty soil. "You know, Senor Martinez, in my line of work, we often encounter men who believe they can resist progress." His voice carried the practiced smoothness of someone accustomed to wrapping threats in velvet. "Most eventually come to understand the wisdom of cooperation. The others..." He left the sentence unfinished, letting the implications hover in the evening air. Daniel's response came with the measured calm that had steadied his SEAL team during the most harrowing operations. "In my experience," he said, each word precisely chosen, progress built on threats tends to be short-lived. The security lights caught the edge of a scar running along his neck, a souvenir from a close-quarters battle in Fallujah that had earned him his first silver star. The former GAFE operator's posture shifted subtly, his trained eye catching details that most would miss. The way Daniel's weight was perfectly distributed for explosive movement, how his seemingly relaxed hands could transition to combat readiness in a fraction of a second. Professional recognition flickered across his face, the dawning realization that they were dealing with something far more dangerous than a simple farmer. "Your time in the Navy," Ramirez continued, his tone probing. "Our sources suggest you weren't. Just an ordinary sailor, something more specialized, perhaps." The cartel leader's eyes narrowed, studying Daniel with renewed interest. The evening wind carried the sweet scent of corn silk, mixing with the metallic tang of weapon oil from the enforcer's concealed firearms. A memory surfaced in Daniel's mind. A moonless night in the Hindu Kush, his team surrounded by hostile forces, maintaining absolute calm while evaluating multiple threats. That same combat-honed awareness now tracked every minute movement of the four men before him, noting their positions, their angles of attack, their increasing signs of unease. "Special. Operations has a way of teaching patience," Daniel replied, his voice carrying undertones of steel beneath its calm surface. "It shows you how to read situations, to understand when someone's reaching beyond their capabilities." His green eyes, which had tracked targets through night vision scopes in the world's deadliest combat zones, met Ramirez's gaze with unflinching steadiness. The scar-faced man's hand had drifted closer to his weapon, but uncertainty had crept into his movement. Years of cartel enforcement had taught him to read potential victims, and something about Daniel's demeanor was triggering deep-seated warning signals. The security lights cast harsh shadows across his face, emphasizing the tension in his jaw. "Perhaps we should be more direct," Ramirez said, his diplomatic facade cracking slightly. "The Rodriguez family, they made the wise choice. Their property now contributes to a larger operation, one that benefits everyone involved. Your land, Senor Martinez, it holds strategic value. The location, the water rights, the proximity to certain transportation routes." The wiry enforcer had continued his attempt to maneuver into a tactical advantage, but Daniel's subtle adjustments kept neutralizing his efforts. It was like trying to corner smoke. Every seemingly casual movement met with an equally casual counter that maintained perfect situational control. The enforcer's frustration began to show in the tightening of his shoulders. "Let me share something I learned in combat," Daniel said, his tone conversational, yet carrying absolute authority. "When you're surrounded by hostile forces, the first step is to accurately assess your situation." His eyes moved deliberately from man to man, letting them see they were being evaluated by someone intimately familiar with violence. The second is to understand the difference between intimidation and actual threat. The automated sprinklers shut off with a pneumatic hiss, leaving behind a pregnant silence broken only by the gentle evening breeze through the corn stalks. In the distance, a coyote called again, its cry seeming to mock the tension-filled standoff. The security lights cast long shadows across the farmyard, turning the familiar landscape into an arena of potential conflict. "Are you threatening us, Senor Martinez?" Ramirez asked, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. The other men had subtly adjusted their positions, responding to their leader's shift in tone. The former GAFE operator's hand now rested openly on his holstered weapon, while the wiry enforcer had moved to establish a clear line of fire. Daniel's laugh carried no humor, only the cold certainty of someone who had faced far worse situations. "Threats are for people who lack the capability to act," he said, each word precise and measured. "I'm simply helping you understand the reality of your situation. You've built your reputation on intimidating civilians, but right now you're standing in front of someone who's led combat operations in places that would give your sicarios nightmares." The change in atmosphere was immediate and palpable. The cartel members exchanged glances, professional recognition of elevated threat levels passing between them without words. The scar-faced man's expression had transformed from confident menace to focused calculation, reassessing their tactical situation with combat-trained eyes. "Your Navy service record," Ramirez began, his voice carrying less certainty now. "It mentions multiple deployments, commendations, but the details..." He paused, studying Daniel's impassive face. "The specifics are classified. Our sources couldn't access them." The admission carried reluctant respect, acknowledgement that they had wandered into deeper waters than anticipated. "Since we're exchanging information," Daniel said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded some of the world's most elite warriors, "let me fill in some gaps in your intelligence." The security lights cast his shadow long across the farmyard, stretching toward the cartel members like a physical manifestation of his growing influence over the situation. Lieutenant Commander Daniel Martinez, Navy SEAL Team 6, retired. He let the words land with precision, watching comprehension dawn in their eyes. 16 years of special operations experience, 4 tours in Iraq, 3 in Afghanistan, 2 in locations I'm still not allowed to name. The former GAFE operator's hand tightened visibly on his weapon, professional recognition mixing with growing apprehension. The evening wind carried the sweet scent of corn silk across the tense scene, a peaceful counterpoint to the deadly serious. Revelation unfolding. Ramirez's practiced composure wavered slightly, his right hand unconsciously adjusting his gold watch, a tell that betrayed his recalculation of the situation. The wiry enforcer had frozen in place, his tactical maneuvering forgotten as the full implications of Daniel's identity sank in. 7 years ago, outside Ramadi, Daniel continued, his tone matter-of-fact, my team was surrounded by 32 hostile combatants. We were outnumbered, outgunned, with no immediate support available. His green eyes, which had seen through the darkness of countless combat operations, fixed on Ramirez. Want to know how that situation ended? The scar-faced man's expression had transformed from professional menace to focused evaluation. His military background allowed him to understand exactly what Daniel's revelation meant. They weren't facing a simple farmer who might break under pressure, but a highly trained combat operator whose calmness under threat had been forged. In the world's deadliest battlefields, your reputation in the region, Daniel said, shifting his weight almost imperceptibly to maintain tactical advantage. It's built on intimidating civilians, farmers, shop owners, people who can't fight back. But right now, you're standing in front of someone who's led some of the deadliest classified operations in recent military history. The security lights caught a bead of sweat tracking down Ramirez's temple, despite the cooling evening air. The cartel leader's carefully constructed facade of sophisticated menace had begun to crack, revealing the uncertainty beneath. His next words came carefully, measured, like someone testing thin ice. Our organization has significant resources, connections that extend far beyond this region. Let me tell you about resources, Daniel replied, his voice carrying the weight of combat. Experience. In special operations, we learn to understand the difference between apparent strength and actual capability. Your show of force might work on civilians, but to someone who's conducted high-stakes operations across 3 continents, it looks exactly like what it is: amateur theatrics trying to mask fundamental weakness. The former GAFE operator shifted, his weight uneasily, his combat training allowing him to recognize the lethal capability that lay beneath Daniel's calm exterior. The man's eyes darted between his companions, noting their gradually deteriorating confidence. His hand remained on his weapon, but the gesture had transformed from threat to desperate reassurance. "The Rodriguez family," Ramirez began, attempting to reassert control through his usual tactics of implied threats, but Daniel cut him off with a sharp laugh that carried no humor. "Angela Rodriguez stopped by the farm yesterday," Daniel said, his voice taking on an edge of steel. "Told me how your men threatened her mother, pressured her father with carefully orchestrated accidents until they felt they had no choice but to sell. That's your style, isn't it? Targeting the vulnerable, exploiting people's fears." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But fear works both ways. Right now, I'm betting you're starting to understand what real fear feels like." The automated irrigation system in a distant field cycled on, its mechanical rhythm providing a steady counterpoint to the tension-filled silence. The evening shadows had lengthened further, turning the familiar farmyard into an arena where two very different kinds of power were being measured against each other. "Your classified operations," the scar-faced man spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the rough edge of someone who had seen combat. "They wouldn't happen to include the Mosul incident in 2018. The question revealed more than he intended. Recognition of specific operations that had become legendary among military professionals. Daniel's slight smile carried no warmth. "You know I can't confirm or deny specific missions." His eyes met the former soldiers. "But I will say this, the techniques we perfected in certain urban combat situations would work just as effectively here. Every building, every shadow, every approach to this farm. I've spent weeks mapping out defensive positions, planning for various scenarios." The wiry enforcer's hand had begun to tremble slightly. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. The man's eyes darted between Daniel and the SUVs, calculating distances, likely already thinking about retreat. The security lights caught the movement, making his uncertainty visible to everyone present. "Professional courtesy," Daniel continued, his voice level but carrying absolute authority. "That's why I'm giving you this warning. Every cartel operation within 50 miles of this farm, every business arrangement you've forced on local families, I've documented all of it. Names, dates, locations, bank transactions. One phone call sends that information to people who've been very interested in your organization's activities." Ramirez's jaw tightened, the muscle visible beneath his expensive suit. The cartel leader's composed exterior had cracked further, revealing the growing realization that they had catastrophically underestimated their target. His next words came slowly, carefully chosen. "Such information could be dangerous, Senor Martinez, for everyone involved." Daniel's response carried the same steady calm that had guided his team through the most harrowing combat situations. "You know what's interesting about danger?" he said, his eyes moving deliberately from man to man. "In special operations, we learn to calculate risk versus reward with absolute precision. Right now, your risk factors are climbing exponentially." The security lights cast harsh shadows across Ramirez's face, highlighting the beads of sweat that had formed despite the cooling evening air. The cartel leader's expensive suit, meant to project sophistication and power, now seemed like costume jewelry, flashy but fundamentally worthless in the face of genuine strength. "Let me paint a clearer picture," Daniel continued, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded elite warriors through countless missions. "While you've been building your network of intimidation, I've been building something else. A detailed intelligence file, documenting every aspect of your operations in this region." The former GAFE operator's expression shifted minutely. professional recognition of a superior tactical position. His military training allowed him to understand the full implications of what Daniel was describing. This wasn't just a threat, it was a carefully prepared operation with multiple contingencies. Every property you've acquired through threats, Daniel said, maintaining perfect situational awareness as he spoke. Every accident that convinced farmers to sell, every connection between your legitimate businesses and your actual operations. It's all documented. Right now, that information is secured with fail-safes that would automatically trigger if anything happened to me or this property. The wiry enforcer's hand had moved away from his weapon, his earlier aggressive posture replaced by barely concealed anxiety. The man's eyes kept darting to the SUVs, calculating escape routes with growing urgency. The scar-faced man remained more controlled, but his combat experience made him acutely aware of how completely they had lost the initiative. In Fallujah, Daniel said, his tone almost conversational, we learned that superior numbers don't always equal tactical advantage. Sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one who's prepared for every contingency, who's thought through every scenario while others were relying on intimidation. A nighthawk swooped overhead, its shadow briefly crossing the tense scene like nature's own surveillance pass. The evening wind had picked up, carrying the scent of distant rain, along with the sweet perfume of flowering corn. These peaceful farm elements seemed to mock the deadly serious confrontation unfolding beneath the harsh security lighting. Your organization's reputation, Daniel continued, his green eyes fixed on Ramirez. It depends on fear. Take that away, and what's left? A group of men in expensive suits, playing at power games they don't fully understand. His words carried the weight of someone who had seen real power, real conflict, real consequences. Ramirez adjusted his gold watch again, a nervous tell that betrayed his growing understanding of their situation. The cartel leader's carefully constructed world of threats and intimidation was crumbling in the face of something he hadn't encountered before, someone who understood the true nature of violence and power. The thing about special operations, Daniel said, shifting his weight almost imperceptibly to maintain tactical advantage, is that we learn to think several moves ahead. While you were gathering surface-level intelligence about my military service, I was mapping your entire operation, every safe house, every distribution route, every corrupt official on your payroll. The former GAFE operator's hand had begun to tremble slightly on his weapon, professional recognition mixing with growing fear. His combat experience told him they were facing someone who operated on a completely different level, not just a trained warrior, but a strategic thinker who had already outmaneuvered them before they even arrived. Your choices are becoming limited, Daniel stated, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who had commanded life or death decisions. Right now, there are 3 separate encrypted files ready to be transmitted to federal agencies at my signal. One goes to the DEA, another to the FBI's Organized Crime Division, and the third to certain military contacts who take a special interest in cartel activities near the border. The security lights caught the subtle changes in the men's postures. The slight slouch of deflating confidence, the unconscious step backward, the widening eyes of growing realization. Their world of intimidation and forced cooperation was being systematically dismantled by someone who understood the true mechanics of power and violence. In combat, Daniel continued, maintaining his relaxed but ready stance, we learned to recognize the exact moment when an opponent realizes they've lost the initiative. I'm seeing that recognition in your eyes right now. You came here thinking you were the predators, only to find yourself in the crosshairs of something far more dangerous than you imagined. A distant rumble of thunder provided nature's punctuation. To his words, the promise of an approaching storm, adding urgency to the confrontation. The wind had picked up further, sending waves through the cornfields that looked like dark water in the harsh artificial lighting. The familiar farmyard had transformed into an arena where psychological warfare was being conducted with surgical precision. "Your reputation in this region," Daniel said, his words measured and precise, "it's built on exploiting people's fears of what might happen. But I've seen what actually happens in real combat situations. I've led men through scenarios that would make your intimidation tactics look like a child's game. The question is, are you prepared to find out the difference between threatening violence and facing someone who's mastered its application?" The night air hung heavy with tension as Daniel faced the cartel enforcers, their once confident postures now tinged with growing unease. Ramirez's expensive suit seemed to hang off his frame, the fabric suddenly appearing cheap and ill-fitting under the harsh glare of the security lights. The cartel leader's eyes darted between his men, seeking reassurance but finding only reflected uncertainty. "I've seen men like you before," Daniel said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "In Kandahar, in Fallujah, in a dozen other places where power is measured in blood and fear. You think you're the apex predators, but you're just scavengers feeding off the terror you create." His words carried the weight of someone who had stared into the abyss of human violence and emerged unblinking. The former GAFE operator's hand had dropped away from his weapon, the instinctive gesture of a man realizing he was outmatched. The scar on his face stood out in stark relief, a reminder of past battles that now seemed insignificant compared to the one he faced. His eyes met Daniel's, and a flicker of understanding passed between them, the recognition of one combat veteran to another, acknowledging the true nature of the situation. "Your choice is simple," Daniel continued, his tone as implacable as the desert sun. "Walk away now, and your organization survives to see another day. Push this any further, and I'll dismantle your entire operation piece by piece, starting with the four of you." The words carried no hint of boast or bravado, only the calm certainty of a man who had made such decisions countless times before. Ramirez's throat worked as he swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing like a drowning man gasping for air. The cartel leader's eyes flicked to the SUVs, gauging the distance, calculating odds, looking for any way to salvage his crumbling position. But Daniel's gaze held him pinned, a predator's stare that promised swift and decisive action at the first sign of resistance. The wiry enforcer broke first, his nerves shattering like a piece of cheap ceramic. He took a stumbling step backward, his retreat as much psychological as physical. The scar-faced man shot him a look of pure contempt, but the damage was done. The cartel's united front had fractured, and with it, any remnants of their carefully cultivated image of invincibility. "This isn't over, Senor Martinez," Ramirez managed, but his words rang hollow, a final, desperate attempt to cling to a rapidly disintegrating illusion of control. "You think you can threaten us, but you have no idea of the true scope of our influence. We have friends in high places, people who can make your life very difficult." Daniel's laugh was as sharp and humorless as a sniper's report. "Your friends in high places," he said, each word as precise as a bullet, "are already detailed in the files I mentioned. Judges, politicians, law enforcement, every compromised official on your payroll. When this information comes to light, your entire support structure will crumble." The events of the previous night seemed almost dreamlike in the clear light of day, a shadow play of threats and countermeasures, of power asserted and dominance challenged. But the quiet emptiness of the farm road, usually bustling with the comings and goings of farm life, served as a stark reminder of the cartel's sudden panicked departure. The silence held a sense of victory, but also a profound unease. Daniel sipped his coffee, his eyes scanning the gentle hills and swaying cornfields, seeing not just the beauty of the present, but the echoes of the past. This land had known struggle. Before, had weathered the crises of the Revolution, the Civil War, the Dust Bowl. Each time it had emerged changed, but unbroken, its scars becoming part of its story, its strength. Now, a new chapter had been written, and Daniel couldn't help but wonder what the future would bring. A distant engine broke the morning stillness, the sound carrying across the fields with unusual clarity. Daniel tensed, his senses sharpening, old instincts flaring to life. But as the vehicle came into view, the green and white of a Border Patrol SUV, he relaxed marginally. The vehicle trundled up the drive, coming to a stop near the house, a light trail of dust settling in its wake. Sheriff Tom Ramirez, no relation to the cartel leader, stepped out, his weathered face creased with concern. He approached the porch, slowly, his eyes taking in the quiet scene, the absence of the usual morning activity. His gaze met Daniel's, a silent question hanging between them. "Tom," Daniel said by way of greeting, his voice even, betraying none of the tension that still thrummed through his veins. "What brings you out here so early?" The sheriff's eyes narrowed, his expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Got a call from Miguel Rodriguez early this morning," he said, his voice as rough as the landscape. "Says the Martinez cartel just up and left town, pulled out all their people, all their operations." Daniel took another sip of coffee, letting the silence stretch for a moment. "Is that so?" he said at last, his tone carefully neutral. "I suppose that's good news for the county." Tom's frown deepened, his gaze sharpening. "I suppose," he said, drawing out the words. "Funny thing, though, Miguel says they left in a hurry, like they were running from something, or someone." Daniel met the sheriff's gaze steadily, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Well," he said, a note of irony creeping into his voice, "I guess even the cartels can have a change of heart." The sheriff regarded him for a long moment, his eyes searching Daniel's face for some clue, some hint of the truth. But Daniel had learned long ago how to keep his secrets close, how to wear his calm like armor. Finally, Tom sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Daniel," he said, his voice softening, "I know you've got history with these kinds of situations. I've seen your service record, or at least what's not blacked out. If something happened last night, if you had something to do with the cartel's sudden departure, I need to know." Daniel met his friend's eyes, seeing the concern, the unspoken questions. He considered his words carefully, weighing the implications of each syllable. "Tom," he said at last, his tone measured, "all I can tell you is that the Martinez farm is safe. My family's land is secure. As for the rest, sometimes it's better not to ask too many questions." Daniel found himself the subject of curious glances and hushed whispers wherever he went. At the feed store, at the diner, at the weekly farmer's market, he could feel the weight of speculative gazes, could hear the murmur of gossip swirling in his wake. He bore it all with a stoic grace, his expression revealing nothing of the turmoil that still churned beneath his calm exterior. The media, drawn by the sudden power vacuum in the region, descended on the county like vultures to a carcass. Reporters from national networks and big city papers prowled the streets, seeking sound bites and sob stories, digging for the seedier details of the cartel's abrupt exit. But the people of Santa Rosa, long accustomed to keeping their own counsel, met their inquiries with stony silence, a united front against the prying eyes of the outside world. Through it all, Daniel went about his business, tending to the farm, with the same quiet dedication that had always defined him. He mended fences, repaired equipment, and planned for the coming harvest, losing himself in the soothing rituals of the land. But even as his hands went through the familiar motions, his mind was never far from the shadow world he thought he'd left behind. Late one evening, as he sat in his study poring over maps and reports, a soft knock at the door broke his concentration. He looked up, his senses sharpening, old instincts flaring to life. Crossing to the door, he opened it cautiously, his body tensed for trouble. But it was Miguel Rodriguez standing on his porch, his weathered face creased with worry. "Daniel," Miguel said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "They found a body out by Hawk's Ridge, one of the Cartel boys, shot through the back of the head." The news settled over Daniel like a lead blanket, a grim confirmation of the trouble he'd known was brewing. He ushered Miguel inside, the graveness of the situation etched in the lines of his face. They sat in the living room, the silence heavy with unspoken fears. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, dark and ominous. Miguel wrung his hands, his eyes haunted. "This wasn't just a settling of scores," he said, his voice hollow. "This was a message. The cartel, they're not done with us. They're just getting started." Daniel leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his eyes intense. "Miguel," he said, his voice as soft as the whisper of wind through the corn. "The cartel made a mistake, thinking this county would roll over without a fight. But make no mistake, this is a fight, and it's just beginning." Miguel met his gaze, a flicker of hope warring with the fear in his eyes. "But what can we do, Daniel? We're just farmers. We're not like you." Daniel's smile was grim. "No, Miguel, you're not like me, and that's a good thing. But you are strong. All of you, stronger than you know. And that strength, that unity, that's what will see us through." He stood, pacing to the window, his eyes scanning the night-shrouded fields. "I have resources, Miguel. Connections from my time in the service. People who can help, who can make sure the right kind of pressure gets applied in the right places. But the real battle, the one that matters most, that's going to be fought right here, on this soil, by the people who call it home." Miguel nodded slowly, the weight of Daniel's words settling over him. "What do you need us to do?" he asked, his voice steadying, a glimmer of steel in his eyes. Daniel turned back, his face set with determination. "We start by sending a message of our own. A message that Santa Rosa is not a battleground, not a prize to be won or lost. We show them that we are a community, united and unbreakable. We watch out for each other, we protect our own, and we don't back down. Not an inch, not a step." Miguel stood, his shoulders squaring, a new resolve in his posture. "I'll spread the word," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. "We'll show them what the people of Santa Rosa are made of." Daniel clasped Miguel's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity, of respect. "I know you will," he said, his voice filled with quiet confidence. "Together, Miguel. That's how we'll win this. Together." Long after Miguel had gone, Daniel sat in the darkness of his study, his mind churning with plans and possibilities, with the weight of the task ahead. He knew the road would be long, the fight grueling. The cartel was wounded, but far from defeated. They would strike back, hard and vicious, seeking to reassert their dominance, to crush any resistance. But Daniel also knew the strength of the people he stood with, the unbreakable spirit of a community forged in the crucible of hardship. They had weathered storms before, had faced down threats and emerged stronger for it, and they would do so again, united in their determination to defend what was theirs. As the night deepened, Daniel's resolve hardened into a diamond edge. He would use every skill, every tool at his disposal to protect this place, these people. He would call in favors, leverage secrets, and make deals with the devils of his past if that's what it took. The shadows of his old life would be a weapon, a shield, a cloak of protection wrapped around the heart of this community. But even as he planned and plotted, he knew that the true strength, the real power, lay not in the shadows, but in the light, in the unbreakable bonds of family and friendship, in the love of the land and the fierce determination to defend it. That was the heart of Santa Rosa, the beating pulse that no cartel, no outside force could ever truly conquer. And so, as the first hints of dawn began to color the eastern sky, Daniel Martinez sat in his study, a warrior and a guardian, a farmer and a friend, ready to face whatever the new day might bring. The battle was just beginning, but he knew with a certainty that went bone deep that they would emerge victorious. For the land, for the people, for the unbreakable spirit of Santa Rosa, they would fight, and they would win. As the sun rose, over the hills, casting a golden glow across the valley, the people of Santa Rosa awoke to a new day, a new reality. The news of the cartel member's body found at Hawks Ridge spread like wildfire, a grim reminder of the danger that still lurked in the shadows. But rather than cowing the community, the news seemed to galvanize them, to stoke the fires of resistance that had been smoldering since the cartel's first incursions. In the town square, a crowd gathered, their faces set with determination. Farmers stood shoulder to shoulder with shopkeepers, teachers with mechanics, a united front against the darkness that threatened to engulf them. At the center of the crowd, Daniel stood on the steps of the old courthouse, his presence a rallying point, a beacon of strength. "My friends," he began, his voice carrying across the square, "we stand here today not as individuals, but as a community, a family. The cartel thinks they can break us, can bend us to their will through fear and violence, but they underestimate the strength that lies within each and every one of you." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, heads nodding, eyes alight with a fierce pride. Daniel continued, his words painting a picture of a future free from fear, a future where their children could grow and thrive without the shadow of the cartel hanging over them. "We will not be cowed," he declared, his voice ringing with conviction. "We will not be broken. We will stand together as one, and we will fight for what is ours, for our land, our families, our way of life, and we will prevail." The crowd erupted in cheers, a roar of defiance that echoed off the buildings and filled the square. In that moment, they were not just farmers and shopkeepers, teachers and mechanics. They were warriors, ready to defend their home, their heart, against any who would seek to destroy it. As the cheers died down, Daniel stepped back, his eyes scanning the crowd, taking in the faces of those he had sworn to protect. His gaze landed on Maria Suarez, standing tall and proud beside her husband, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She met his gaze, a silent understanding passing between them. This was their fight, their stand, and they would make it together. The days that followed were a flurry of activity, of preparation and planning. Daniel worked tirelessly, coordinating with Sheriff Ramirez, reaching out to his contacts in the shadows, gathering the pieces he would need for the battle ahead. But even as he immersed himself in the familiar dance of strategy and tactics, he never lost sight of the true source of their strength. It was there in the way the community came together, in the small acts of kindness and solidarity that wove them into an unbreakable whole. It was in the meals shared, the stories told, the laughter that rang out in defiance of the darkness. It was in the way they looked out for each other, stood up for each other, refused to let fear divide them. And it was there in the quiet moments, the stolen glances and gentle touches, the love that blossomed amidst the chaos. Daniel found himself drawn to Maria, to her quiet strength and fierce determination. In her, he saw a reflection of his own spirit, a kindred soul, forged in the fires of adversity. They came together in stolen moments, in the spaces between the planning and the preparation. A brush of hands as they passed in the street, a shared glance across a crowded room. And then, one night, in the stillness of Daniel's farmhouse, they came together in a rush of passion and need, their bodies speaking the words their hearts had long held silent. In the aftermath, as they lay tangled in each other's arms, Maria traced the scars that mapped Daniel's body, each one a testament to the battles he had fought, the sacrifices he had made. "You carry so much," she whispered, her fingers ghosting over a particularly jagged line. "So much pain, so much weight." Daniel captured her hand in his, bringing it to his lips. "It's the price of the life I've chosen," he said softly. "The burden I bear so that others don't have to." Maria's eyes shone in the moonlight, a mixture of love and sorrow. "You don't have to bear it alone," she whispered, her voice a caress. "Not anymore." And in that moment, Daniel felt something shift within him, a weight lifting, a wall crumbling. He pulled Maria closer, burying his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her. "Together," he murmured, the word a promise, a vow. "We'll bear it together." As the days turned into weeks, the community of Santa Rosa stood united, a bulwark against the gathering storm. They trained together, learned together, grew together. Farmers became soldiers, shopkeepers became spies, each person finding their place, their purpose in the tapestry of resistance. And at the center of it all, Daniel and Maria stood side by side, leaders and lovers, warriors and dreamers. They drew strength from each other and from the unbreakable bonds of the community. They served. Together, they would weather the storm, would face down the darkness, would fight for the light. For they knew with a certainty that went soul deep that their love, their unity, was a force more powerful than any cartel, any army. It was the heart of Santa Rosa, the beating pulse that would carry them through the battles to come and into the brighter future they would build together. And so, as the sun set over the hills, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold, the people of Santa Rosa stood ready, a community transformed, a family forged in the heat of adversity. The road ahead would be long, the fight fierce, but in each other they had found an unbreakable strength, an unstoppable spirit. Together they would stand, together they would fight, and together they would triumph, a shining beacon of hope in a world too often shadowed by fear. For in the heart of Santa Rosa, in the love and the laughter, the tears and the triumphs, they had found something worth fighting for, something worth dying for. They had found home. And for that, they would move mountains. For that, they would face any storm, would stare down any darkness. For that, they would write a new chapter in the history of their land, a story of courage and community, of love and resilience, a story of hope, rising like the sun over the hills, chasing back the shadows and promising a new dawn, a new day. A story of Santa Rosa and of the unbreakable spirit that would carry her into the future, come what may. As the weeks turned into months, the people of Santa Rosa settled into a new rhythm, a new normal. The specter of the cartel still loomed, a constant presence at the edge of their consciousness, but it no longer held the same paralyzing power. They had faced their fear, had looked into the darkness and refused to blink, and in doing so, they had reclaimed a piece of themselves, a piece of their community. Daniel and Maria found themselves at the center of this new rhythm, leaders not just in the fight against the cartel, but in the daily workings of the town. They organized committees and councils, working groups and watch rotations, each designed to strengthen the fabric of the community, to weave them into an unbreakable whole. There were challenges, of course. The cartel did not take their defiance lightly. There were skirmishes and incursions, moments of terror and loss, but each time the community rallied, coming together in a show of unity and resolve that left the cartel reeling. Through it all, Daniel and Maria's love grew, a bright flame amidst the darkness. They stole moments when they could, a shared meal, a quiet walk, a tender embrace. In each other they found solace and strength, a reminder of what they were fighting for, of the future they hoped to build. But even as they savored these moments of peace, they knew that the true test was still to come. The cartel was wounded, but not defeated, and they would not rest until Santa Rosa was back under their heel. Daniel knew this with a certainty born of long experience, and he worked tirelessly to prepare for the coming storm. He trained the town's defenders, honing their skills, sharpening their instincts. He fortified key locations, setting traps and fallbacks, creating a lattice of defenses that would make Santa Rosa a fortress. And he reached out to his contacts, calling in favors, gathering resources and intel, weaving a web of support that stretched far beyond the borders of their small town. And then, on a moonless night, the storm broke. The cartel attacked in force, a wave of violence and terror that threatened to engulf the town. But Santa Rosa was ready. They met the assault with a wall of steel and fire, a united front that left the cartel stunned and reeling. Daniel was everywhere. That night, a whirlwind of controlled violence, a one-man army standing between his community and the darkness. He fought with a skill and ferocity that left even his closest allies in awe. A lifetime of training and experience distilled into a single, perfect moment of clarity. But even as he fought, his thoughts were with Maria, with the promise of the future they had whispered in the dark. She was his anchor, his North Star, the light that guided him through the shadows. And he knew with a certainty that went bone deep that he would move heaven and earth to get back to her, to build the life they had dreamed of. The battle raged. Through the night, a symphony of chaos and courage, of desperation and determination. The people of Santa Rosa fought with a bravery that would echo through the ages, a shining example of what a community could achieve when they stood together. And as the sun rose over the hills, casting its golden light over the smoke and the rubble, over the blood and the tears, it illuminated a scene of triumph, of hope. The cartel was broken, their power shattered, their reign of terror at an end. Santa Rosa had won. In the days that followed, as the town began to rebuild, to heal, Daniel and Maria found themselves at the center of a new chapter, a new beginning. They stood hand in hand amidst the rubble, leaders and lovers, warriors and dreamers, ready to guide their community into a brighter future. There would be challenges ahead, scars to mend, wounds to heal, but they would face them together, drawing strength from each other and from the unbreakable bonds of the community they had forged in the crucible of adversity. And as they looked out over the town, over the land that had shaped them, that had made them who they were, they knew that they were home. This was their place, their people, the heart and soul of who they were. And for that, they would fight, would bleed, would sacrifice. For Santa Rosa, they would build a future, a legacy, a story of resilience and rebirth, of love and hope, rising from the ashes of fear and violence. A story that would be told for generations, a beacon of light in a world too often shadowed by darkness. Daniel pulled Maria close, his arms encircling her, his heart full to bursting. "We did it," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "We won." Maria leaned into him, her head resting on his chest, her smile brighter than the sun. "No, my love," she murmured, "we're just beginning." And as they stood there, two hearts beating, as one, two souls entwined, they knew that it was true. Their story, Santa Rosa's story, was just beginning, and what a story it would be, a story of community, of courage, of love conquering all. A story of a small town that stood tall, that faced down the darkness and emerged victorious. A shining city on a hill. A story of hope, rising like the sun over the hills, chasing back the shadows and promising a new dawn, a new day. A story of Santa Rosa and of the unbreakable spirit that would carry her forward into a future bright with promise. And at the center of it all, Daniel and Maria, leaders and lovers, warriors and dreamers, ready to face whatever the future might bring. Together they would build, together they would grow, together they would love. For they were Santa Rosa, and Santa Rosa was them. One community, one family, one heart, beating strong and true beneath the vast Texas sky. A story of hope, of home, of the unbreakable bonds that tie us all together, across time, across distance, across all the challenges and changes of life. A story, in the end, of love. Love for the land, love for each other, love for the dream of what could be, of what would be. Love, rising like the sun, lighting the way forward step by step, hand in hand, heart to heart. Love, the heart of Santa Rosa, the soul of their story. A love that would endure, that would conquer, that would shine now and forever, a beacon in the darkness, a promise of a brighter tomorrow. And so the story of Santa Rosa, of Daniel and Maria, of a community united, came full circle. A tapestry woven of courage and hope, of sacrifice and triumph, of love, enduring and eternal. A story that would live on, that would inspire, that would remind us all of the power of the human spirit, of the unbreakable strength that lies within us all. And so, hand in hand, heart to heart, Daniel and Maria stepped forward into the future they had fought for, the future they had won. They knew there would be struggles ahead, knew that the price of peace was eternal vigilance. But they also knew that they would face those struggles together, knew that the love they shared, the bond they had forged, could overcome any challenge, could conquer any fear. They were Santa Rosa, now and forever. And their story, the story of a love that could move mountains, of a community that could stand against any storm, would echo through the ages, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a beacon of hope for all who heard its call. And so on that golden morning, as the sun rose over the hills of Santa Rosa and the world awoke to a new day full of infinite promise, Daniel and Maria embraced their destiny, their birthright, their shining future. And hand in hand, heart to heart, they stepped forward to meet it, to shape it, to make it their own. For they were the heart and soul of Santa Rosa, the living legacy of all those who had come before, of all those who had fought and bled and sacrificed to build this shining city on a hill. They were the guardians of that legacy, the stewards of that dream. And they would not rest, would not waver, until that dream was made manifest, until the story of Santa Rosa, the story of love and hope triumphant, had spread to every corner of the earth, lighting the way for all humanity. This was their mission, their calling, their sacred trust. And as they set out to fulfill it, as they took the first steps on the long and winding road ahead, they did so with heads held high and hearts afire, secure in the knowledge that they walked not alone, but in the company of all those who shared their vision, their passion, their unshakable faith in the power of the human spirit to overcome any obstacle, to achieve any dream. They were Santa Rosa, now and forever. And the world would never be the same. Here is the conclusion to the story of Santa Rosa in approximately 1,200 words. The years turned into decades, and the legend of Santa Rosa only grew. Under the wise and compassionate leadership of Daniel and Maria, the community flourished like a rose blooming in the desert. Their love story became the stuff of local lore, the battle-hardened warrior and the spirited school teacher, united by a love that could overcome any adversity. As their children grew, Daniel and Maria instilled in them the same values that had become the bedrock of Santa Rosa: courage, integrity, compassion, and an unyielding commitment to family and community. Esperanza, their firstborn, grew into a brilliant and fiery young woman with her father's strategic mind and her mother's empathetic heart. She took up her parents' mantle, becoming a guiding light for the next generation. Though the specter of External threats never fully disappeared. Santa Rosa weathered each storm with the resilience and unity that had become its hallmark. The community banded together, drawing strength from one another and from the unwavering leadership of the Martinez family. Daniel, though his hair grayed and his steps slowed with the passing years, never lost the sharp edge of his tactical brilliance or his deep devotion to his people. He continued to serve as a watchful sentinel, guarding against any darkness that threatened their hard-won peace. Maria, with her boundless heart and her gift for nurturing young minds, became the soul of Santa Rosa. The school she had founded flourished under her guidance, becoming a beacon of learning and growth for the entire region. Her students adored her and carried the lessons she taught them throughout their lives, becoming the next leaders, thinkers, and dreamers of the community. Together, Daniel and Maria grew old, watching with pride as their children and their children's children took up the mantle of leadership. They savored each moment of peace and happiness, knowing in their bones the price that had been paid. For these simple, sun-drenched days, there were times late at night when the old wounds would ache and the shadows of memory would grow long. In those moments, Daniel and Maria would hold each other close, drawing strength and solace from their unbreakable bond. They would whisper to each other the stories of their youth, of the battles they had fought and the love they had found, remembering the friends they had lost and the miracles they had witnessed. And always, as the dark night gave way to the first blush of dawn, they would reaffirm their vow, their sacred promise to each other and to Santa Rosa. They would continue to stand watch, to guard against the darkness, to nurture the light. They would love each other and their family and their community with every fiber of their being until their last breath. As the years flowed on, Santa Rosa became more than just a town. It became a symbol, a living testament to the indomitable human spirit. Its story spread, carried on the wind and the whispers, inspiring others to stand up, to fight back, to believe in the power of unity and love. Leaders from across the nation, and then the world, came to seek the wisdom of the legendary Martinez couple. They came to learn the secrets of Santa Rosa's success, to understand how one small town had managed to stand against the tide of violence and despair and build something beautiful and lasting. And Daniel and Maria, with the humility and grace that had defined their lives, would share their hard-earned wisdom. They would speak of the power of community, of the unbreakable strength that comes from standing together. They would speak of the necessity of vigilance, of the constant, tireless work required to maintain peace and security. But above all, they would speak of love, the deep, fierce, unyielding love that had been their North Star, their guiding light through the darkest of storms. In time, as age finally began to catch up with them and the mantle of leadership passed fully to the next generation, Daniel and Maria could often be found sitting together in the golden light of the Santa Rosa evenings. They would watch the sun dip below the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and they would hold hands, their weathered fingers intertwined, their hearts beating as one. They would look out over the thriving community they had nurtured, at the laughter of children playing in the streets, at the bustling shops and the lush fields, at the shining faces of their loved ones. And they would feel a deep, unshakable sense of peace, of fulfillment, of gratitude for the miraculous journey that had been their life together. In those quiet moments, Daniel and Maria knew that their legacy was secure. They had fought the good fight, had run the race, had kept the faith. They had loved each other and their family and their community with a love that could move mountains and part seas. They had shown the world that hope could triumph over fear, that light could banish darkness, that even in the face of the greatest adversity, the human spirit could rise, could soar, could shine. And so, as the last light faded and the stars began to glimmer in the velvet sky, Daniel and Maria would retire to their bed, holding each other close as they drifted off to sleep. They knew that whatever lay beyond this life, they would face it as they had faced everything else, together, hand in hand, heart to heart. Their story, the story of Santa Rosa, would live on, told and retold by generations yet to come. It would be a story of courage and community, of resilience and rebirth, of the unbreakable power of love. It would be a reminder, a promise, a call to arms for all those who heard it, a call to stand up, to fight back, to believe in the possibility of a better world. And through it all, the spirit of Daniel and Maria, the indomitable spirit of Santa Rosa, would endure, shining like a beacon in the night, guiding the way forward for all those who followed in their footsteps. For they were Santa Rosa, and Santa Rosa was them, now and forever. A shining city on a hill, a testament to the incredible, unstoppable power of the human heart. Their legacy, their love would live on, igniting the flames of hope and courage in hearts across the world until the very end of days. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through the story of Santa Rosa and the unforgettable love shared by Daniel and Maria. Their tale of resilience, courage, and the unbreakable power of community has touched hearts around the world, and we hope it has inspired you as much as it has inspired us. If you've been moved by this compelling narrative, we invite you to subscribe to our channel for more uplifting and thought-provoking content. By subscribing, you'll become a part of our global community of storytellers and story lovers, united in our passion for sharing the tales that illuminate the human experience and remind us of the boundless potential within us all. As a subscriber, you'll be the first to know about our latest stories, from gripping sagas of love and adventure to profound reflections on the nature of hope, courage, and the ties that bind us together. You'll also have the opportunity to engage with our talented community of writers, artists, and fellow listeners, sharing your own insights and experiences. So don't miss out on the chance to be a part of something truly special. Subscribe today and join us on this ongoing journey of discovery, inspiration, and connection. Together we can keep the spirit of Santa Rosa alive, shining a light of hope and resilience in a world that needs it now more than ever. Thank you again for being a part of our story. We can't wait to share more with you in the days and years to come.